I think he's got a real clear understanding of all the issues and a real good grasp of all the issues.
And during the few moments that we have left, we want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
We'll now go to agenda item number 18, which is former agenda item number 1.
Report of the full council, item number 18, Council Bill 116268, relating to the premises use and occupancy agreement between the City of Seattle and the Professional Basketball Club, LLC, approving termination of the agreement in accordance with the Professional Basketball Club, LLC, and City of Seattle Settlement Agreement Memorandum of Understanding, and repealing ordinance number 122492.
Are there any comments on the ordinance that would provide for this termination?
It would be nice to have it in time to read it.
Well, it is what we were given essentially a week ago, and so I really appreciate Councilmember Drago pointing out that this had not been attached to the ordinance, which does seem like it was kind of an irregular thing to do. So we now have this attachment here, and it's now attached to the ordinance. Councilmember Harrell.
Are we discussing the substance of the ordinance now?
We are now, yes.
I guess I have more of a question or concern, I suppose, that is, as I understand it, I guess the question I had earlier was, because there's still some uncertainty about the settlement, there's still some conditions that have to be negotiated, there's some language, as I understand it, in the settlement that talks about, you know, the lease can be reinstated. I guess the question earlier I had was, should we terminate the lease prior to all of those specifics being worked out? Were we doing it prematurely? And having researched this in the last hour or so...
No, I can't believe that I'm hearing this.
And having researched this in the last hour or so, as I understand it, we really don't have much of a choice, because if you go to the settlement agreement, if the City Council did not terminate the lease, we basically forfeit the $45 million, as I understand it in Section 5. So I want to make sure that I'm proceeding with a correct understanding. The other issue that had sort of come up was, as I was better understanding the Seattle Sonic history section 6 of the settlement agreement, you know, we were looking at some stats that are now being, you know, tossed around like on ESPN's websites, and you'll notice all that stuff has shifted to Oklahoma now. So like you look at the 95-96 season where, you know, we were Western Conference champs, all that, Seattle's deleted from it now, and it says Oklahoma, which is sort of apparently, unfortunately, where we're heading. So again, I want to make sure I'm reading the stuff correctly, because it was my understanding that a lot of the history, the memorabilia piece, all that was still sort of being negotiated. But if I'm understanding correctly, if we don't approve this, if we don't terminate the lease, we basically walk away from $45 million.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth!
So I'd just like someone to respond to that.
Well, I can respond to you and say that that is my understanding of the settlement agreement. And I think that for the public, I'd like to maybe take a couple minutes just to explain the history of this and how we got to where we are. And I'm not going to go into the whole history, because that would take a long time. But just in terms of this settlement agreement, the city essentially entered into a lawsuit as a result of concerns that the Sonics were about to terminate their lease or break their lease, which would be a violation of the terms of the agreement. And the lawsuit was essentially an attempt to get them to live up to the terms of their lease. The only thing that the city had the authority to do, we had no authority to compel them to remain after 2010, but the lease did provide that they had to remain in Key Arena for 2 years. So the city going into this lawsuit essentially was attempting to make sure that we did not wind up holding the bag if they broke the terms of their lease without providing compensation to the city, and in the hope that somehow there might be something else that would emerge that might wind up leaving a team here for a longer period of time. as time went on, it became clear that that was not going to be something that was likely to happen, and it seemed very dubious that that would be the kind of relief that would ultimately be granted, since there was nothing in the lease agreement that it would require any team to stay here after 2010. So as a result of that, the city attorney did enter into negotiations to attempt to come to a settlement of this agreement. And it's very important to note that that is a city attorney responsibility. The attorney acts with the guidance and assistance of the council and mayor, but the city attorney is the one who essentially has the authority to make a decision on whether to settle or to pursue a lawsuit based on his best judgment, again, with the advice of the clients, the council and mayor, as to what is likely to happen in terms of the city. So that is essentially the pattern that has brought us to this point, and we, none of us like this particular settlement. We don't think it's, at least I guess I should speak for myself, but I'd say for myself, this is not in any way the optimum solution that anybody was hoping for, in my understanding. The optimum solution that everybody was hoping for would be that the team would have found a way to remain here, and we would have been able to find a way in which to continue things. But that did not seem to be an option, and so the result of that was that we wound up with a situation where we had a negotiated agreement that we believe treats the city as best we possibly can in terms of our financial outcomes that might happen, and does give us the hope and the promise that at least there would be some consideration of a team in the future. I, again, want to say what I had to say at the news conference, which is that we should not have too many illusions about that. This is a hope and a promise. It is by no means a guarantee. And whether we can actually realize that is going to depend on a lot of very hard work over the next several years. So from my perspective, the real background to this and the real issue is that the NBA, the sports magnates, the people who own these teams, essentially are treating the fans as something that's fungible, that can be simply thrown away and replaced with some new fans when they feel like doing something like this and moving to another city, and they have made that decision. And the city of Seattle has done its best to try and figure out a way in which to mitigate or prevent that outcome, but we do not ultimately have the authority or control over that outcome. It is a private business, and a private business that makes decisions based on their own business considerations. So the fans are the people who are being tossed about and who are being essentially left in the lurch by the NBA and the companies associated with them, and we are fortunate that we've finally found a way in which we can at least get that relationship a little bit better so that we have the prospect of possibly doing something in the future. But we should be really clear that this is not an outcome. Councilmember Harrell. Okay.
Thank you for that. And again, what I'm trying to do is zero on what we're trying to do today, and I just want to make sure I have a correct understanding of what's occurring. As I understand it, if the Schultz litigation is successful, and the team somehow is required legally to come back, then the lease will be reinstated according to the settlement agreement.
That is correct, yes.
If, for whatever reason today, we did not approve the termination of the lease, then we would, in essence, walk away from the $45 million, and the city would proceed in litigation only on the specific performance claim, not on the money claim, not on the damage claim. So we can proceed with litigation, but only on the issue of specific performance. And I guess, well, I'll stop there, and I think that's what we're doing today, as I understand it, because again, I was trying to get up to speed on this fairly quickly.
Yes, that is correct. And if the city won its lawsuit, essentially the court would then return and say, well, you either have to stay for 2 years, or you have to find some way in which to buy your way out of that 2 years, but could make no guarantee about what would happen 2 years from now. Are there any other comments?
Yes.
Councilmember Burgess.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to slightly change the subject. 6 months ago, we sat here and passed a resolution asking the mayor and the director of Seattle Center to negotiate a lease for Key Arena with the Seattle Storm. We voted unanimously in favor of that resolution. The mayor concurred with us. And when it became clear that the Sonic Storm organization was going to leave Seattle, 4 local women stepped forward and negotiated the purchase of that team, and that team is playing at Key Arena and playing quite well, I would mention. And now it's time for our city government to step forward and make sure that we successfully bring a conclusion to those negotiations for the Storm to continue to play at Key Arena, and so that Seattle take the steps necessary to make sure that the Storm remains economically strong and viable in our city. And I think it's important for the mayor and the Seattle Center director to know that the council is unified in our desire to see that a collaborative process brings that lease negotiation to an early conclusion.
Thank you. Councilmember Drago.
Well, to quote Council President Conlon, it is a sad day to lose the Sonics. But on the flip side, we did help save the Storm. And this council was very instrumental in helping to save the Storm, and with the strong support of the mayor. With the severance of this lease, it has significant impacts on the Storm organization, because the Storm and the Sonics have, from the beginning, been sharing practice space, equipment, administrative costs, and personnel, and now that means added costs for the Storm. The Storm play a minimum of 16 games here during the season, and more if they make the playoffs, which they did once, and that was pretty glorious. So 16 games is significant. It's probably the largest user of Key Arena. So we need to do what we can to support the Storm, keep them vital, and keep them in Seattle.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councilmember Harrell.
Looking at today's legislation, I see we're repealing, of course, Ordinance 122492. In that ordinance, there is significant language devoted to the Storm, but we're terminating the lease with the Sonics, but in that same lease, we're not terminating or modifying the lease with the Storm, correct? None of this affects that.
It's a separate
That's correct.
It's a separate lease, okay, so.
But weren't they owned by the same organization? So terminating the lease with them, would that have any effect on the Storm?
Well, what I know is that the Storm does have a separate lease, which they are negotiating now, and that needs to be completed by September. So it is it's a separate lease for Key Arena.
There is no lease in place for the Storm now. If this is separate.
No, there is a lease in place for the Storm, but it's not part of this lease.
We have a signed lease.
I believe so, because they are negotiating, they're in the process of negotiating a lease.
Okay, are there any other comments?
No. Again, I'm not going to be, I'd look back, I've been trying, there's not a copy of the lease anywhere around, so I went back and looked at the ordinance, the original ordinance, which apparently, and that was the 122492, that we're repealing. In that ordinance, there's considerable language devoted to the Storm, so I have to assume that this lease that we're terminating, no one has a copy of that in front of them, apparently, so what I'm hearing then is that lease specifically applies to the Sonics. That's a separate lease, and we're repealing the ordinance that does contain Storm language in there, but this isn't a problem, what I'm hearing.
It's my understanding that the original lease was only with the Sonics, that the Storm were added later to that lease when the Storm were created, and that what we're repealing is the agreement with the football club that actually at one time owned both of those, but we have a separate lease now with the Storm because it is under different ownership.